In the context of exploding devices, can superpower defense exporters remotely turn off weapons like missiles and fighter jets that they sell to us? That's a great question. I think I've kind of touched on this in the past, but let's once again revisit this topic. Uh, let's say the US, superpower defense exporters like Lockheed Martin, whatever else, right? We're talking about American missile, American weapon systems, and they sell General Atomics, those Reaper drones and Sea Guardian drones and all kinds of stuff, right? So let's say the Americans have sold a certain weapons system to a friendly nation, let's say to Australia. In the 1980s, they sold F-15 fighter planes to the Australians, the Americans. And Australia is essentially, well, one of the closest allies the US has, right? Five Eyes. So the Americans sold a bunch of F-15 fighter planes to the Australians. And the Australians very rapidly discovered that when they take these fighter planes for a spin, and as a simulation, they try to lock the targeting mechanism of the fighter plane onto, let's say, some ship in the sea. It would refuse to lock on to that ship. It would allow the pilots to lock the targeting mechanism only on predetermined targets that the Americans have programmed into the F-15s and nothing else. The Australians could not do a thing about it. I mean, as the owner of the weapon system, the F-15 fighter plane that you have paid for, you bought it, you should be able to use it to target whatever you want, right? But they could not. And then apparently they hacked into the American database or whatever, and eventually they were able to, after like 20 plus years, they were able to modify the software and make the F-15s do whatever they wanted. So the Americans have done that. So that's not exactly remotely turning off weapons, but that's about you know making weapons, giving you weapons that won't serve the purpose, that won't do what you want them to do. Handicapped. Um, but I'm sure it's also possible for the Americans to remotely switch off, turn off weapons that they may not want you to use. For example, the Pakistanis have a bunch of F-16s, and a few years ago there was the whole Balakot thing, right? India took out a terrorist nest of snakes somewhere in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and then the Pakistanis next day retaliated by sending a bunch of F-16s across the border to target some Indian infrastructure. If the Americans wanted, they could have prevented those F-16s from taking off. So I'm sure the Americans have the ability to do that. And the same goes for missiles and whatnot. I think the Americans can do whatever they want with missile systems and weapon systems they have designed and built. So if you, for example, if India has Chinook helicopters, or India has those Reaper drones or whatever, and hypothetically, in a completely hypothetical scenario, if India were to you try and use those drones to, let's say, do surveillance activities on American warships, maybe you won't get any data out of it or something like that. So they can control everything you're doing. So that's the peril that you are under when you purchase weapon systems from the superpower. Now, will that also apply to weapons you buy from Russia, France? I think when it comes to Russian weapons, they have been tried and tested in battlefield conditions, and the Russians have never uh, prevented remotely or whatever India from using weapon systems. But the possibility is always there. So that's why you have to be completely self-reliant when it comes to weapons systems. Every single thing has to be manufactured at home, whether it is a bullet, whether it is a shell casing, whether it's a howitzer, whether it's artillery pieces, whether it's tanks, whether it is missile boats, corvettes, warships, destroyers, aircraft carriers, fighter planes, helicopters, missiles, short range missiles, drones, whatever it is, you have to, submarines, and the list goes on. You have to manufacture it yourself. That's the only way you can be 100% sure that it's going to work as per your expectations. So, yes, it's a great question you asked, and the answer is they can turn it off if they want.